Proverbs chapter 1. We're reading from Proverbs chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching, for they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck.
Well, good morning, and grace to you and peace from God our Father. Let's try that again. Good morning. There we go. I didn't think I sounded like I was on. It is good to see you this morning. It's good to have you here and good to have some visitors. I know that we have some of our own that are out for spring break and other reasons, so we're grateful that all of you are here with us, and we want the grace and the peace of God to be upon you this morning. This past year, psychologist Jordan Peterson put out a book. Maybe you've seen it on bookshelves as you've gone to different stores, and it's simply called The 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote for Chaos. If some of you maybe seen this book, it's become a bestseller. Maybe you've heard of Jordan Peterson. He's become popular over the past year or so because of some of the speeches that he has made. A very intelligent man, and this book, though, is really about giving 12 simple rules for life. Some of those rules are like, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Every time I read that rule, I do that. Stand up straight with shoulders back, or make friends with people who want the best for you, or tell the truth, or at least don't lie. And we look at those rules and we think, well, those are pretty simple rules. It seems as if it's common sense, and yet this book has become a bestseller. It's become very popular. And there's some good things that are in it, and people are reading it, and I hear all about it and from different things that I listen to and watch. But why is it that this type of book has become so popular in our society and in our culture today? I think it's become popular because people are finding in this book something that they don't normally find in books today. Something that they're hungering for that they don't realize they're hungering for until they read it. And that is practical, everyday wisdom. We might call it common sense. Things that just make sense. Things that you can do that are simple and that are easy, but that are wise, that will help make your life a little better. It shouldn't really surprise us that people are hungering for something like this. When we look at our world around us and we see the way that people are living their lives, it shouldn't surprise us that they're hungering for a little bit more wisdom. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of pain and there's a lot of suffering and there's a lot of difficulties that people have to endure that they can't help, that they have nothing that they can control about that particular situation. I think of civilians in war-torn countries. They have nothing to do with that, and yet they're having to suffer. I think of people who have disabilities and sicknesses and struggles that they have to endure, and it has nothing to do with them. But you realize also that there's also another side to that, because there's another type of suffering and another type of difficulty that we sometimes endure simply because of poor choices, because of unwise living. Because we've made some bad decisions that have led us to the consequences of those actions. I think of people's bodies who are hurting because they've abused them in the past. Other individuals are addicted to certain substances because they weren't mindful of the harmful consequences of them. You have people who ended up in prison and in jail, and the reason that they're there is simply because they chose the wrong crowd to hang out with. And you have these consequences. You have individuals who are in an insurmountable amount of debt. Maybe that's some of us this morning because of poor financial choices that we've made in the past. So the lives that we're living and the difficulties that we're enduring many times are due to our own decisions. We make poor, unwise decisions, which is somewhat ironic because we live in a day and time where we have greater access to more knowledge than ever before, right? With the swipe of our finger and And with a click of our thumb, we can have instantaneous access to almost inexhaustible knowledge. There's no shortage of YouTube videos and blog articles and news stories that are wanting to give you a piece of advice, a way to live your life that will make it better. In fact, you could probably open your phone right now and look at a blog story or look at a news story, and it'll say, do these things, these 5 things this week, and your life will be so much better, right? It's always 5 things. Do 5 things or 3 things. Do these 3 things. Or do this one thing, and your life will be better for this week. And so these are the sources that we can easily go to and find wisdom, and yet we see the ramifications within our culture today. The people just aren't living wisely. They're not making good decisions. And sadly, many times that probably even includes us as Christians. But as Christians, we're not so much concerned about what a YouTube video has to say or what social media has to say or even really what Jordan Peterson has to say. That's not the source to which we go to in order to gain our wisdom as God's people. We're not concerned about that little w wisdom. We're concerned about that big wisdom that comes from God and from God alone and is discovered within His Word. Now, I would agree that you can find and discover the wisdom of God from Genesis to Revelation all through. There's wisdom all throughout this wonderful book. But there's a specific set of books that are often referred to as wisdom literature. And it's a segment of books that really focuses in on wise living, the consequences of unwise living, and what we can do to live more wisely in our lives. And mostly those include Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Job. Now, Song of Solomon and Psalms sometimes are included within that as well, but Job and Ecclesiastes and Proverbs really are considered the wisdom literature within Scripture. But specifically, the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs. Now, Proverbs does not dive into any deeply theological themes. For a while we were studying the book of Romans. Romans is deeply theological. It's about diving into very deep subjects about the redemption of God, the justification of man, and God's eternal purpose within Christ. Those are deep themes. Proverbs isn't really concerned about that. In fact, its goal is to tell people in a very direct way how to live successfully. It's about helping you to get to the destination to where you want to go. It's about reminding people that the life that you're living has consequences. And in fact, the life that you're living and the choices that you're making, it might feel right at the beginning, but eventually the destination where you're going to end up is not where you want to be. It's like getting on a plane and flying first class to a destination that you really don't want to go to. He says that's what some lifestyles are like. In fact, if you could sum up the entire message of Proverbs in a simple phrase, we could maybe say that the message of Proverbs is this: don't be foolish. Don't be foolish. And in fact, this morning, we are going to begin a new series through the book of Proverbs titled simply, Don't Be Foolish. And this morning, it's a very simple lesson. It's just an introduction lesson to the series. We want to ask questions like, what are Proverbs? What's the point of them? Why do we need them? And who exactly is going to be talking within the book of Proverbs? And who are the characters that are there? And so that's what we want to look at this morning as we start the series, is first by asking the question, what are Proverbs? By the way, just as a side note, we did send out a schedule. I'm trying to help you in this to invite friends and family members. We sent out a schedule of the different lessons that we're going to be going through in your email over the next several weeks so that you can know what lessons are coming up, and maybe you have a friend or a family member that's interested in that lesson and they want to come and listen to it. So hopefully that can be of aid to you. So let's ask first the question, what are Proverbs? What is a proverb? Now, whether we realize it or not, we grew up listening to Proverbs all the time. A penny saved is what? A penny earned, right? We say things like, if you can't say something nice, what? Don't say anything at all. The early bird gets the worm, right? And those are Proverbs. Whether we realize it or not, we grew up hearing these proverbs. And you probably have your own proverbs that your family said. And the South, of course, has its own set of proverbs, right? If you go somewhere else and you say a proverb that you heard in the South, they might say, what in the world are you talking about? So there's all kinds of proverbs that we've lived by. But the question is, what exactly are they? What is a proverb? Well, there's a variety of different ways that we could describe a proverb. For example, we might call Proverbs simply a short sentence of wisdom. They're very concise. They're not very long. We'll see that within the book of Proverbs as we go throughout. Generally speaking, these Proverbs are one sentences. Sometimes they're a little bit longer, but generally speaking, they're one sentence. They're short. You can carry them with you. In fact, you might have memorized certain Proverbs in your life, and you might just be able to easily bring it out in a conversation because it's so easy to memorize. As we go throughout this study, I want to encourage you to find a few Proverbs, and maybe I'll try and incorporate that in to have a proverb a week that we want to try and memorize together that goes along with our lesson, because I think it's really easy to memorize certain proverbs, and I want to encourage you to do that. Another definition that I found was short sentences drawn from long experience. Short sentences drawn from long experience. Generally speaking, wisdom implies that someone has lived through this before and they're trying to help you out. They're trying to give you wisdom as to how they saw it and how you can avoid certain things and guarantee a better way of life. So short sentences drawn from long experience. And then there was another definition that was found by it said a compact, portable distillation of wisdom. It's compact, it's portable, and it gets down to the very bones. It gets down to the very foundation of wisdom. So that's probably a good idea of what a proverb is. But when we look to the Old Testament book of Proverbs within the Bible, what we're discovering is a collection of these short, pithy sentences of wisdom. That's really what we're looking at. But you realize there's actually, the Proverbs and Proverbs in general are not simply contained to this one collection. There's actually Proverbs that are used throughout the Bible at different periods of time. You might not have realized that. For example, in 1 Kings 20 and verse 11, King Ahab tells Ben-Hadad, who is an opposing enemy king, and he says he's going to conquer Israel so easily, and he's bragging about how he's going to beat Israel. And King Ahab tells him, "Let not him who straps on his armor boast himself as he who takes it off." I'm sure you've used that proverb before. In fact, you have, because a modern day translation of that would be, "Don't count your chickens before your eggs hatch." Right? That's essentially what King Ahab is saying. Another one is one that Jesus uses later on in Luke 17 and verse 37. And he says, "Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Again, I'm sure you've used this in daily language and in some of your conversations. In fact, we do. We might say, "If you build it, they will come." Right? So there's these proverbs that are used throughout different generations and in different cultures. And in fact, the widespread use of proverbs shows us that they're not limited to one particular culture. They're used throughout a variety of different cultures, and they're a way of the community passing on their collective wisdom to the next generation. Now, we believe that the book of Proverbs is ultimately from the mind of God. That's why it's so practical. That's why it's so good. It points us to not just better living now, but better living for eternity. So we believe it's from the mind of God. But there are different authors within Proverbs that bring about these collections. In fact, Proverbs does not have a single author. And you may not realize that. Generally speaking, when we come to Proverbs, we think, well, it was written by Solomon. Some of them are. Some of them are written by Solomon, but there's other authors as well. And so when we think of Proverbs, we need to think of it as a collection of collections. A collection of collections. You have Solomon, who wrote some of them. For example, in Proverbs 1 and verse 1, it says the Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. You see that in chapter 10 and verse 1 as well, in which it says these are the Proverbs of Solomon. But then there's this other group that is known simply as the wise. For example, in Proverbs 22 and verse 17, incline your ear and hear the words of the wise and apply your heart to my knowledge. Now, the wise within ancient cultures were a group of individuals who were kind of held up by their society as these are our intellectuals. They would refer to them as sages. These are the sages. And so Proverbs records things from the wise sages of Israel. In fact, one of those sages is recorded as the author of some of these Proverbs in chapter 30 and verse 1. And his name is Agur, the son of Jakeh. Notice the words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, the oracle. The man declares, I am weary, O God. I am weary, O God. I'm worn out. So there's another author of some of these Proverbs. We don't know anything else about Agur except for this particular proverb that mentions some of his wisdom. Then you also have a character by the name of King Lemuel, an individual by the name of King Lemuel. The words of King Lemuel in Proverbs 31 and verse 1, an oracle that his mother taught him. And so he there is passing on some wisdom that his mother passed down to him. What's interesting about Proverbs is that it does give us some insight into how these sayings were collected. In Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 1, it says, these also are the Proverbs of Solomon, which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. Now that's very interesting because you don't always have Old Testament books that mention that. But here, the Proverbs writer lets us know that there was a process by which they gained these collections of Proverbs. Now all in all, the book of Proverbs contains about 500 wise sayings. And as I mentioned earlier, many of them are one-liners, but some of them are a little bit more extended. So that's what we're coming to, what the Proverbs are and what the book of Proverbs is about. Which, by the way, when I think of the book of Proverbs, I can't help but think of Carl Garner. Because whenever we were in school, Brother Carl wanted to teach us how to write bulletin articles, and we had to pick 2 different proverbs, and we had to write bulletin articles on them. And if you go back and you read some of Carl's bulletin articles, which we will run occasionally in the bulletin, a lot of his are based on Proverbs. And of course, Carl was a wise man, and we know why that is. So I think of Carl as we go throughout this study. Now, here's the question, though, that we want to look at next, and that is, what exactly are the Proverbs about? What are the Proverbs about? I mentioned this earlier, but I do want you to understand this, that over the next course of the next few weeks on Sunday mornings, these are not deeply theological issues. There's not a lot of really investigating some of the deeper implications of theology. But Proverbs is about practical, everyday living. It's about life in the here and now. It's things like what you should do about your family, the hazards of risky behavior, what a man should look for in a spouse, how to relate to people in authority, hard work, controlling your tongue. All of those things are found within the book of Proverbs. These are practical, everyday lessons that we can discover here. In fact, if you look at Proverbs chapter 1, starting in verse 1, the Proverbs writer, and we're going to come back to this, or one of the Proverbs writers, says this. He says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know, here's the purpose statement of the book, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand the words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing and righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and to the one who understands, obtain guidance. So here the Proverbs writer, as we refer to him later, the narrator of the collections, he's saying, listen, this is the point. I want to give you wisdom, and I want you to listen to what I have to say to you. I want you to learn from it. I want you to live a better life, and I want you to avoid some of the pitfalls that others have gone through. And when we're looking at that, again, don't we need that in our culture today? Don't we need that in our daily walk with Christ? Don't we need a little bit more wisdom? I don't know about you, but I do. And that's why I'm excited about doing this series together. Now, there is something that we need to understand. I think this is an important thing for us to remember as we go throughout this series. And it's simply this, that Proverbs are not promises. Proverbs are not promises. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is this. Proverbs do not tell us how life will always work out, but how it generally works out if you follow the path of wisdom. And the reason I'm telling you this is because sometimes we've misunderstood Proverbs. For example, Proverbs 10 and verse 4 says, "A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich." Now what he's saying there is if you work hard, you're going to become rich. You're going to have wealth. Does that always work out that way? No, it doesn't. But generally speaking, in fact, the Ecclesiastes writer says something almost the opposite of that in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 11. "Again I saw under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all." The Ecclesiastes writer presents the other side of the coin. So essentially what the Proverbs writer is saying is that generally speaking, if you work hard, you're going to receive the bounties of that. You're going to receive the fruit of that. Are there exceptions to that rule? Absolutely there are. Are there individuals who are lazy and who are slackers and yet they have many riches? Yes, there are. But generally speaking, this is the path of wisdom, and if you follow it, certain things will occur. Now, one of the most popular proverbs that I think is one of the most misunderstood is Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6, which says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he's old, he will not depart from it." There's been many parents that have agonized over this verse because their children have fallen away from the Lord or they've lived a difficult life and they think, well, I obviously didn't train them up in the way they should go because the Proverbs writer says if I would have done that, then they wouldn't have departed. They wouldn't have left. Now, interestingly enough, I'm not even sure that he's talking about what we think he's talking about. There's a possibility that the Proverbs writer is talking about training a child in the discipline of a trade, the way that the Proverbs writer is thinking of this, so that when he is old, he will not depart from that trade. You're training him, as the fathers would have done, to have a particular trade in his later years, so that he would have something to sustain himself from. But even if it is talking about discipline and rearing children up within the Lord, this is not a sure promise statement. There's been many godly parents who have raised their children to the best of their ability, and yet those children have fallen away. And it doesn't mean that they have not trained their children up in the way they should go. Brethren, if that was the case, then that would apply to the Lord as well. Because God has done more than anyone to train up His children in the way they should go, and yet we depart from Him, don't we not? What would that say about the character of God? If this was just a complete sealed statement. It's not. He says, generally speaking, if you train a child up in the way they should go, they're not going to depart from it. But that doesn't mean that there aren't exceptions to the rule. That also doesn't mean that simply because there's exceptions to the rule of wisdom, that this general principle isn't true, because it is true. So those things are important for us to remember going throughout this study. The third question we want to ask, and I think this is important, is why do we need them? Why do we really need the Proverbs? What's so important about them? Again, they're not deeply theological, so why do we need them? Well, I think we need to teach them, number one, because we don't teach on them very often. And the reason we don't teach on them very often is because they're very difficult to teach. I've wanted to do a series through Proverbs for quite a long time. But I've struggled with learning how to engage the text and talk about the different themes that go throughout Proverbs. Because again, they're just short, pithy statements. And so I wanted to be careful about how I did it. I recently was actually introduced to some material, and I want to give him some credit for it. A man by the name of Tommy South, who put some material together on Proverbs, and he titled it a little bit different, but a friend of mine introduced me to the material, and it helped me to organize it a little bit better, and we're actually following his pattern of things and how he played it out. And so if you are interested in that material, I can forward it to you later. But so we neglect it because it's difficult to teach. It's difficult to teach. But also, we neglect it because I think we don't feel like we really need the wisdom of community. Generally speaking, we feel as a society that we don't need the wisdom of previous generations. We don't need the wisdom of community. We're our own man. We're self-made people. We're individuals, and we have enough access to enough knowledge, as we mentioned earlier, to know what to do and how to do it. You don't have to tell me how to do something. I just need a YouTube video for that. And Proverbs are kind of an old-fashioned way to pass down wisdom, aren't they? I mean, who really needs Proverbs? Well, brethren, we need it. We need the Proverbs because our individualistic approach to morality and to ethics and to living is absolutely killing us. It is absolutely killing us. Despite all of our success, despite all of the knowledge that we have, despite all of the wisdom that we claim to have, we have a culture and a society that is consumed by unhappiness, by bitterness, by violence, by hurtful relationships, by neglected relationships, by fractured relationships. We're consumed by all kinds of addictions, dysfunctional living, various fears and phobias. We had this terrible shooting that occurred this past week in Christchurch. And this individualistic approach, that's simply an outgrowth of a way of thinking, an evil way of thinking, as are the many shootings that occur in our own nation. Our individualistic approach in which we say, listen, I'm going to determine what's right in my own eyes. I don't need the community. I don't need other people to tell me what's good and what's right and what's a healthy way to live. It is absolutely killing us as a society. We need the Proverbs now more than we ever have, I'm convinced. And it should cause us to step back. The way that we see our lives and the way that we see people living, it should cause us to step back and say, there's got to be a better way to live. There's got to be a better way to do this thing called life. And the Proverbs writer essentially is saying, there is a way to live better. There's a better way to live. And let me tell you this, not only is wisdom about what benefits us as individuals, it's also about what benefits our community. If I'm living better and living more wisely, it is going to bless and benefit my neighbor. It is going to bless the people that you are around and that you have relationships with for you to listen to what the Proverbs writer has to say. It's going to benefit them as well. And what great motivation that is to study this great collection of sayings. So essentially, we need the book of Proverbs because of what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 10 and verse 23. I know, O Lord, that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man who walks to direct his steps. Jeremiah says, listen, it's not in us. It's not within us to know how to live and go about wisely directing our steps. We need some higher direction. We need some higher wisdom from you, God. And we know that to be true. Now, the book of Proverbs, if you want to think of it this way, can be kind of like a stage or a play. And there's a variety of different characters that we're going to see throughout this study. And we need to familiarize ourselves with these characters because they're going to come up at a variety of different times throughout the Proverbs. So let's look at that together briefly before we close the lesson out. And that is the cast of characters within Proverbs. The first one we want to examine is the narrator himself. I just realized that's misspelled, but the narrator himself. The narrator is the one who comes within the study and he says, listen, I want to instruct you. We saw that in Proverbs 1 verse 8, where he says, my son, I want to instruct you and give you wisdom and understanding and learning. In fact, some suggest that the book of Proverbs was a training guide for young princes of Israel. And the first one begins with Solomon speaking to his son, David. David speaking to his son, Solomon, or Solomon speaking to his son, rather, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. He's speaking to them and saying, I want you to know how to live as a prince and as a king. And so, generally speaking, they viewed this as a manual for wise living for Israel's princes. The next character that we see within the book is simply known as Lady Wisdom. Now, wisdom is personified within Proverbs as a woman who is calling out to the simple, who's calling out to individuals who are not knowledgeable and saying, I want you to come and partake of my bounties. I want you to come and listen to me. We see in Proverbs 1, 20 through 22 is where she first is introduced. And then later in chapter 8, it says that she was there with God within the creation and how God crafted the creation by wisdom, and he uses wisdom to bring about the universe. So she's an important character personified as a woman, Lady Wisdom, which, by the way, is very interesting, that in a male-dominated society, wisdom is personified as a woman. And it is consistently throughout Scripture personified as a woman, and I think that has something to say about our women. Another character within the Proverbs is the simple. The simple. Now, the simple, these are the target audience of Proverbs. We could translate simple as gullible or silly, easily misled, not fully informed. In fact, in Proverbs 7, 6, and 7, when the adulterous woman comes along, we'll talk about her in a moment, it is a man who is simple, who is from among the simple. He's unlearned. He's gullible. He's easily led astray. And that's who the Proverbs is talking to. Individuals who are easily led astray and trying to convince them to live this wise life. And along with that, out of the simple, sometimes comes the fool. The fool. There are 3 different words in the Hebrew used to describe the fool, or used to translate the word fool within Proverbs. And these words are used almost 50 times throughout the Proverbs. So the fool is a central character throughout this book. The fool is the person who refuses to listen, who constantly chooses his own way above God's. And the Proverbs writer is constantly warning against this person. In Proverbs 15 and verse 5, he'll talk about be careful about this person. That they're going to lead you in a wrong way. And it isn't that the problem isn't intellectual. It isn't that they can't understand, but that they won't understand. Their problem isn't intellectual, it's spiritual. They're refusing to listen to the instruction that's trying to be given to them. And I'm sure that we've all been like that at some point in our lives. And maybe you know someone like that who people try and convince to live more wisely, and yet they continue to choose bad ways and bad living. Now, the next character is similar to the fool. He's referred to as the scoffer. And the scoffer is a special kind of fool. He's a special kind of fool within Proverbs. The scoffer is more adamant in rejecting wisdom. They don't simply refuse to listen, they despise those who do. In Proverbs 9, 7 through 8, we see this. And we see in Proverbs 21 and verse 24 that the greatest issue with the scoffer is that he is arrogant. He's prideful. He doesn't think he needs to hear anything from anybody, and he makes fun of and he ridicules those who try and give him advice. He scoffs at knowledge. Now, there is a character who is almost there for a little bit of comical relief within the Proverbs, and that is an individual known as the sluggard. The sluggard. Even that name sounds funny, right? The sluggard. Sounds like a slug. There's 2 characteristics of this person within Proverbs. Number 1, they're lazy. And number 2, they have an amount of excuses for their inactivity. They make excuses for their inactivity. Notice, for example, Proverbs 26. I find this proverb quite comical. As a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. So a proverb, he said a sluggard is laying on that. They're just like a door. They just go one side to the other. They're like a door on its hinges when they're laying down. They just constantly stay in bed. And then he says this, the sluggard buries his hand in the dish, and it wearies him out to bring it back to his mouth. He says the sluggard's so lazy that when he starts to eat, he loses the willpower to finish the bite before it gets to his mouth. That's how lazy he is. That's the sluggard. And you see the Proverbs writer kind of ridiculing this character as someone, but he is, within Proverbs, he's someone to avoid. He's someone that you don't want to be friends with. He's someone that you don't want to emulate. So there's the sluggard. And then Probably the most dangerous character within the book of Proverbs is the adulteress. The adulteress. She's referred to as the forbidden woman in Proverbs 5 and verse 3 and Proverbs 7 and verse 5. She's referred to as the evil woman in Proverbs 6 and verse 24. And the seductress is always alluring young men into terrible circumstances with false assurances. My husband isn't home. And then the Proverbs writer discusses seeing a man from among the simple who goes in and he's murdered by this adulteress's husband. And so essentially she brings every person she encounters and convinces to come into her, she brings into ruin. She absolutely destroys their life. And one of the messages that Proverbs is trying to get across is how sexual promiscuity will absolutely wreck your life. That's one of the major messages that Proverbs is trying to get across. So here's the point. Here's the point of all of these characters. Don't be foolish like the fool or the scoffer or the sluggard and the adulteress. You may be simple. So receive the instruction of the narrator and take of the bounties of Lady Wisdom, and you will have a successful and productive life. That's essentially the message that we will see throughout the rest of the book of Proverbs. But here's the question for us this morning. Where do you fit? Where do you fit in those categories that we mentioned just a moment ago? Now, all of us have made bad decisions. In fact, if I said, raise your hand if you've made a bad decision in your life, I imagine we all, if we're honest, would say, well, decision or decisions, right? We've all made bad decisions that have led us to places that we never wanted to be, that we never thought it would lead us. We've made unwise decisions. This isn't simply about us having a series of looking at other people and saying, well, look how terribly they lived their lives. It's about looking at our own decisions and the things that we've done. But here's the thing. Don't be foolish this morning by allowing those decisions to continue to wreak havoc in your life. You need to turn to the Lord. You need to seek out His wisdom. And you might be thinking, listen, God doesn't want to hear from me. Listen, you need to realize that if you've lived your life in an unwise way, in a foolish way, that God isn't sitting in heaven with His arms crossed and thinking, oh, now you come to me? Now you want to hear my wisdom? That's not God. In fact, the picture that Scripture paints of God is found in James chapter 1. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. That's the picture that Scripture paints of God. He wants to give you the bounties of His wisdom, and when you can come to Him all day long for wisdom, and God doesn't say, really? More? You need more? Haven't you got this figured out by now? No, He says He does it without reproach. This is our God. He wants you to live wisely. He doesn't want you to be foolish. He wants you to live fully and completely before Him. And over the coming weeks, we're going to discuss exactly what that means within the book of Proverbs. The most foolish decision that you can make this morning, though, is to walk out of this building having not received the gospel of Jesus Christ. We want to encourage you to obey the gospel, to receive forgiveness of sins through faith and repentance, confession, baptism, having your sins washed away. Another foolish decision is if you walk out of this building having a burden, having a difficulty, having a struggle you're going through, and walking out of here without taking the resources of this family and using them and asking for prayers and help and strength, because we're here for that. And so make the wise choice this morning. Whatever your need is, why don't you come as together we stand and as we sing.